The moment my father laughed, the entire room went dead silent. Not a nervous chuckle, not a polite, awkward sound people make when they don't know what else to do. A real, full-throated laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in your chest, the kind that says, "I am not afraid of you, not even a little bit." And Vivian Caldwell standing there in the marble foyer of her $6 million villa, with her champagne flute and her French manicure, and her absolute certainty that she had just destroyed us, went completely white. I'll tell you what she had just said. I'll tell you exactly what happened in that room. But first, let me take you back to the beginning, back to a cold, ugly November in a small town called Mill Haven, Indiana, where I was working a double shift at the Cottonwood Diner and had absolutely no idea that my life was about to get turned inside out. 3 years ago, Mill Haven was the kind of place where everybody knew your business before you did. Population 11,000, one Main Street, 2 stoplights, and a Dollar General that had been opening soon for about 4 years. I'd grown up there. I'd stayed there. Most people who could leave left, but I had my reasons for sticking around, and honestly, at 32, I'd made a kind of peace with the place. My name is Cassie Duran, and for the past 7 years I had been a waitress at the Cottonwood Diner. Not a barista with a side hustle, not a hospitality professional exploring opportunities, a waitress. 40 hours a week, sometimes 50, lunch rush through dinner service, sneakers that smelled like bacon grease, hair permanently tied back, a notepad in my apron pocket. I was good at it. I knew every regular by name and order. I knew who was on a diet and who was cheating on it. I knew how Mrs. Patterson liked her coffee, half-calf, 2 sugars, and heated up twice because she talked too long between sips. I knew things about this town that a sociologist would have paid good money to learn. My apartment was a 2-bedroom on Clover Street that I shared with my 2 cats, Ruthie and Smoke. Ruthie was an orange tabby with a permanently suspicious expression, and Smoke was a gray shorthair who had decided, sometime in the 2nd year of her life, that the world owed her a debt she intended to collect in the form of lap-sitting and tuna treats. They were my constants. When I came home smelling like the diner, they'd meet me at the door like I was the most important person on earth, and honestly, some nights, that was the only thing that felt real. My parents, Dale and Nora Doran, lived 12 minutes away on Prospect Road, in the same house I grew up in. Dad was a retired electrician. Mom worked part-time at the library. They didn't have a lot. They never had. But their house was paid off, their car was reliable, and they had a vegetable garden in the back that produced more tomatoes than any 2 people could reasonably eat. They were good people, steady people. The kind who showed up always with a casserole dish or a helping hand or just a willingness to sit quietly with you when things got hard. That was my world. Small, maybe. Ordinary, definitely. But mine. Then I met Garrett Caldwell. He came into the Cottonwood on a Tuesday in August, 2 summers before that November I was telling you about. He was passing through, or so he said, on his way back from a job site about 40 miles north of Mill Haven. He sat at the counter, ordered the turkey club, and left a $20 tip on a $12 meal. I noticed the tip first. Then I noticed the smile. He was 40, tall, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of easy confidence that makes you think a person has never had a truly bad day. He wasn't flashy, no visible designer labels, no oversized watch, nothing like that. He drove a regular pickup. He talked to me like I was a person, not a waitress, and I know that sounds like a small thing, but when you've worked a service job for years, you understand how rare it actually is. He came back the next Tuesday, and the one after that. By October, we were seeing each other. By Christmas, he'd met my parents. By the following spring, I knew I was in love with him, which terrified me because I hadn't been in love in a long time, and I'd forgotten how exposed it makes you feel. Like walking around with your rib cage open, hoping nobody notices. Garrett was a general contractor who ran his own company out of a town called Harwick, about an hour from Mill Haven. He did well, not ostentatiously well, but solidly, comfortably well. He had a house in Harwick, a good reputation, steady work. He talked about his family occasionally, but not often. His parents were divorced. His dad was in Florida, and his mom, Vivian, lived in a big house outside of Chicago. He described her as particular. He said it carefully, the way people say things when the real word would take too long to explain. I didn't push. I figured I'd meet her eventually. I figured it would be fine. By the time November rolled around, that gray, damp, bone-chilling November, Garrett and I had been together for 3 years. 3 good years, mostly. We didn't live together yet. I was still at my apartment on Clover Street with Ruthie and Smoke, and he was still in Harwick. But we spent most weekends together and had started talking seriously about what came next. He'd mentioned marriage. I'd stopped pretending I wasn't thinking about it too. Then one Thursday evening, he called me after my shift. "My mom wants to meet your parents," he said. "She's hosting a thing at the villa, you know, the property she has down in Clearwater. She wants everyone to come, make it a proper family introduction." I remember sitting on my couch with Smoke on my lap, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the water stain on my ceiling that looked vaguely like the state of Ohio. "The villa," I said. "It's just what she calls it. It's a big house. She likes to make things sound grand." "How big?" He paused. "Pretty big." I found out later, much later, that pretty big meant $6 million of waterfront property with 6 bedrooms, a catering kitchen, and a private dock. But that night I just said okay. I told him it sounded nice. I told him I'd let my parents know. I hung up and looked at Ruthie, who was sitting on the arm of the couch, giving me the suspicious look she reserved for things she didn't trust. Electrical storms, the vacuum cleaner, new situations. "It'll be fine," I told her. She blinked once, slowly, and looked away. My mom was excited when I called her. She immediately started talking about what she was going to wear and whether she should bring something, a pie maybe, or a plant. My dad said, "Sure, sounds like a nice trip," in the mild, agreeable way he said most things, and I felt a little of the tension leave my shoulders. They were good at this. They were warm and easy, and they made people comfortable. This would be fine. Garrett picked us up, me, Mom, and Dad, on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later. It was still that ugly November weather, the kind where the sky is the color of old dishwater, and the wind goes right through your coat. We piled into his truck, and he was chatty and cheerful, and my dad talked to him about a job site they'd both driven past on Route 9, and my mom asked about the drive and whether we'd stop for coffee. It felt normal, easy. It wasn't until we pulled up to the villa's iron gate, the one with the intercom and the stone pillars and the long paved drive lined with bare-limbed trees, that I felt the first small tightening in my chest. Not fear, exactly, more like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and realize you're underdressed, except it wasn't about clothes. It was about everything. The house was enormous. White stone, 3 stories with black-framed windows and a covered portico, and perfectly trimmed boxwood hedges that probably cost more per year to maintain than my annual salary. My mom went quiet. My dad looked at it with the calm, assessing eyes of a man who had spent 40 years working on other people's houses and knew exactly what things cost. Garrett squeezed my hand as we walked to the front door. "She's excited to meet everyone," he said. "She really is." Vivian Caldwell opened the door herself. She was maybe 65, slim, immaculately put together in cream slacks and a silk blouse, with silver hair cut in a sharp, precise bob, and earrings that caught the gray November light and threw it back like a challenge. She smiled at Garrett with the warm, proprietary love of a mother who has never fully released her child. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at my parents. The smile didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Something shifted, just slightly, like a temperature drop you feel before you see it. "Come in," she said. The foyer smelled like fresh flowers and something expensive I couldn't identify. Our shoes clicked on the marble floor. My mother was looking around with wide eyes she was trying to keep politely neutral. My dad had his hands in his jacket pockets, his good jacket, the one he wore to church and to my cousin's wedding, and he was looking at Vivian with the kind of quiet, patient attention he gave to everything. A woman appeared from a side hallway, not a housekeeper, not a caterer, but a woman about my age in a fitted blazer, carrying a leather portfolio, who kissed Vivian on the cheek like they knew each other well. Vivian introduced her as Serena, a dear friend, practically family. Serena looked at me and my parents the way you look at something you've been warned about. We were shown into a sitting room that was bigger than my entire apartment. There was a fire going. There were flowers on every surface. There was a tray of food that looked like it had been arranged by a professional. My mother sat on the edge of a chair like she was afraid to take up too much space, and I wanted to reach over and squeeze her hand and tell her she had every right to sit back, to take up all the space she wanted. But I didn't, because I was still telling myself this would be fine. Vivian poured champagne she hadn't asked if anyone wanted, and then she sat across from us, and she looked at my parents with an expression I couldn't quite name at first, something that was wearing the costume of graciousness, but wasn't quite wearing it right. "So," she said, tilting her head with a smile that didn't touch her eyes, "tell me about yourselves." My dad started to answer. He said something about being retired, about the electrical work he'd done for 30 years, about Millhaven. He said it the way he always talked, easy, without apology, without performing anything. Vivian listened. And then she said, looking at Serena, not at my parents, "How charming, small-town living." It wasn't what she said. It was the pause before charming. It was the slight lift of her chin. It was the way Serena smiled into her champagne glass like she'd been expecting exactly this. My mother's hand tightened slightly on her glass. My dad looked at Vivian for a moment with those quiet, patient eyes. And then Vivian said the thing that changed everything. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her ankles, and said, in a voice perfectly calibrated to sound like an observation rather than an attack, "I suppose I'd hoped Garrett would settle down with someone more established. Broke nobodies trying to crawl into high society. It's such a tired story, isn't it?" She said it to Serena. She didn't look at us when she said it, like we weren't even worth the direction of her gaze. The room went absolutely silent. And then my father laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh. That's the thing people probably imagine wrong when I describe it. They picture something sharp, something aggressive, a laugh designed to cut back. But that wasn't my dad. That had never been my dad. It was the laugh he let out when something struck him as genuinely, deeply absurd. The kind of laugh that said, "I have lived 63 years on this earth. I have pulled wire through walls in January with no gloves on. I have buried my mother and my brother, and I have gotten up the next morning and gone to work. And you, lady, with your silk blouse and your marble floor, you think you have said something that should hurt me." He laughed for maybe 4 full seconds. Then he stopped, set his champagne glass down on the coffee table with a small, careful click, and looked at Vivian Caldwell with the same expression he used when a homeowner tried to tell him he'd done something wrong that he hadn't done wrong. "Well," he said pleasantly, "that's one way to welcome people into your home." Vivian had gone white, and then a faint, ugly color was creeping up her neck. Serena was very still, her champagne glass halfway to her lips, frozen there like she'd been paused. Garrett said, "Mom," in a low, warning voice. Vivian collected herself fast. That was the thing about women like her. They'd had years of practice managing rooms, managing impressions. She smiled, the smile of someone who has decided the best play is to pretend the last 30 seconds didn't happen. "I misspoke," she said. "I was being glib. It came out badly." "It came out exactly the way you meant it," my mother said. I turned to look at her. My mother, Nora Duran, who had never in my entire life raised her voice in anyone else's home, who brought casseroles to people she barely knew when they were sick, who had the patience of a person who'd spent decades quietly doing hard things without making a production of it, was looking at Vivian Caldwell with a calm, clear steadiness that made my chest ache with something I didn't have a word for right then. "Nora," my dad said softly. "No, Dale." She set her own glass down. "I'd like to say something." She looked at Vivian. "I don't know what you were hoping to accomplish just now, but I want you to know something. My husband worked for 37 years so that our daughter could grow up with a roof over her head and food on the table and parents who were home at night. We're not wealthy. We've never pretended to be, but we are not nobodies." She paused. "And I think you already know that. I think that's why you said it the way you did, not to our faces, but sideways, like you were commenting on the weather. Because you wanted to make us feel small, without having to own it." The room was so quiet I could hear the fire crackling. Vivian opened her mouth, closed it. My dad stood up. He was unhurried about it. He always moved unhurried, like a man who had decided long ago that rushing was for people who hadn't figured out how to plan ahead. He buttoned his jacket. "Cassie," he said, "I think we'll head out. Give these folks their afternoon back." And that should have been the moment where I stood up too, where I took my parents' side without hesitation, walked out that marble foyer and never looked back. But I didn't, because Garrett was looking at me with this expression I'd never seen on him before, desperate and ashamed and pleading all at once, and 3 years of loving him were sitting in my chest like a stone I didn't know how to put down, and I said, too quietly, "Dad, maybe we should just—" My father looked at me, just looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I felt it like a physical thing, the disappointment, not sharp, not angry, just there, solid and heavy and real. He nodded once. "We'll wait outside," he said. "Take your time." I watched my parents walk back through that foyer. I heard the front door open and close, and I sat there on the edge of a chair in Vivian Caldwell's $6 million sitting room and felt like the worst version of myself. What happened next over the following hour was a masterclass in how someone like Vivian operated. She was gracious. She was warm, suddenly and convincingly warm, like flipping a switch. She apologized, but not really. Not for the thing she'd actually said, just for the misunderstanding. She had Serena bring out more food. She asked Garrett questions about his projects in that practiced, maternal way that reminded him, subtly and constantly, that she was the center of his world. And she talked to me carefully, pleasantly, in a way that felt like being wrapped in silk that had fishing line threaded through it. By the time we left, Garrett was holding my hand and telling me his mother really did like me, that she was just protective, that she had a way of putting things that didn't always land right. He said she'd called him on his cell while I was in the bathroom and apologized. He said she wanted to have us back for Thanksgiving. I said, "Okay. I know. My parents were waiting in the truck. My dad started the engine without comment. My mom looked out the passenger window the whole drive back. We stopped for coffee at a gas station about 20 miles from Clearwater because there was nothing else open, and we stood in the parking lot in the cold with paper cups, and my dad finally said, "You love him." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. He nodded. "Okay." He sipped his coffee. "But Cassie, you understand what that woman is." "She was rude. She was awful. I know." "No." He looked at me over the rim of his cup. "She was testing you. She wanted to see what you'd do when she pushed. And you stayed in the room." I didn't have an answer for that. Because he was right, and we both knew it, and saying so out loud would have meant something I wasn't ready to mean yet. The drive home was quiet in the way that quiet can be the loudest thing in the world. The weeks after that visit were the worst kind of confusing, the kind where nothing is overtly wrong but everything feels slightly off-key, like a song you know being played just a half-step flat. Garrett called every day. He was attentive and apologetic and loving in the specific way that made it hard to stay angry, which in retrospect I understand was part of the problem. When someone is good to you 90% of the time, it's easy to convince yourself the other 10% is an anomaly. But things were shifting, slowly, the way a house settles, not all at once, just a fraction of an inch here, a crack in the plaster there. Vivian started texting me. Not warmly. Nothing she did was warm without a purpose, but regularly, with a kind of determined chattiness that felt like surveillance wearing the costume of friendliness. She sent articles. She made comments about my job. Not mean comments, just comments. Little observations delivered with a light touch that somehow always managed to land with weight. "Still loving the diner life?" she asked once in a text, with a small emoji at the end that was doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of making the question sound innocent. And then there was the engagement. Garrett proposed on a Wednesday night in January in my apartment on Clover Street, with Ruthie watching from the arm of the couch and Smoke asleep on the radiator. The ring was simple and beautiful, a thin gold band with a small round diamond, nothing ostentatious, exactly what I would have chosen for myself. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I cried a little. He held me for a long time. I was happy, genuinely, completely happy, for about 6 hours. Then Vivian called. Garrett had told her, of course he had, right away, and she was calling to congratulate us, and she was doing it in that voice, the gracious one, the silk with fishing line voice, and she said, "I hope you two will let me be involved in the planning. I have so many contacts, so many wonderful ideas. A wedding should reflect the family, don't you think? The whole family." I said, "Of course, Vivian." I hung up and sat on my bathroom floor for a few minutes, just breathing. It was my neighbor, Patrice, who actually woke me up. Patrice was 58, a retired paralegal who lived in the unit below mine, and who had, over the years, become the kind of friend you don't realize is essential until something cracks, and she's the one standing there with coffee and the correct amount of bluntness. She knocked on my door 2 weeks after the engagement because she'd run into my mother at the library, and my mother, who was not a complainer, had apparently said enough that Patrice understood something was wrong. She sat at my kitchen table and listened to the whole thing. The villa, the comment, my staying in the room, the texts, the phone call, Garrett's apologies that somehow always circled back to his mother's good intentions. When I finished, Patrice was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Does Garrett own any property?" I blinked. "He has his house in Harwick." "Does he rent anything? Does he have any rental properties?" His mom has that villa. He manages it for her sometimes. He handles the contracts when she rents it out." Patrice looked at me in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. "When's the last time you looked at those rental contracts?" she said. "I've never looked at them. Why would I?" She leaned forward. "Because I did some digging after your mom mentioned the property. That villa in Clearwater, the one Vivian calls hers?" She paused. "Cassie, the property is in Garrett's name." The room went very still. "That can't be right," I said. "She talks about it like it's—" I pulled the Pinellas County property records, online. Took me 10 minutes. Patrice folded her hands on the table. "Garrett Caldwell is the legal owner of that property, has been for 6 years. Vivian lives there apparently, but she doesn't own it. He does." I sat with that for a long moment. The marble foyer, the fire, Vivian pouring champagne in a house that, if Patrice was right, she didn't actually own. Playing queen of a castle that legally belonged to her son. "Why would he never tell me that?" I said, and even as I said it, I already knew the answer was worse than the question. Patrice didn't say anything. She just let me sit there and figure out what I already knew, and what I knew was this. Vivian Caldwell had stood in her son's house and called my parents nobodies. She had done it in a property she didn't own, using a power she didn't actually have, performing wealth and authority like a costume she'd been wearing so long she'd forgotten it wasn't her skin. And Garrett had let her. He had watched her do it, and said "Mom" in that warning voice, and then apologized to me later and talked about her good intentions. My phone was sitting on the kitchen table between me and Patrice. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I picked it up and called my dad. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been asleep, which meant my mother had already told him about her conversation with Patrice's source, or maybe he'd just been sitting in the living room on Prospect Road, the way he sometimes did late at night, watching old westerns with the sound low. "Hey, Bug," he said, his name for me since I was 4 years old. "Dad." I looked at Patrice across the table. She gave me a small nod. "Did you know the villa is in Garrett's name?" A beat of silence, just one. "I had a feeling something was off about that property," he said. "The way she talked about it. Too much ownership in her voice for someone who was just the owner." Patrice pulled the Pinellas County records. Garrett has owned it for 6 years. Another silence, longer this time. "Cassie," my dad said, "what do you want to do?" That was always his question. Not what should you do, not here's what I think, just what do you want to do? Asked in a voice that made clear he'd help with whatever the answer was. I had taken that for granted my whole life, and only understood what it was worth sitting in my kitchen with Patrice and 2 cats and an engagement ring on my finger and a stone in my chest. I want to go back, I said. I want to go back to that house with the facts, and I want to look her in the eye. My dad didn't say anything for a moment. Okay, he finally said. Then that's what we'll do, together. I spent the next 3 days doing homework. Patrice helped. She was a paralegal for 22 years, and she knew exactly how to read a property record, a deed history, a chain of title. The villa on the Clearwater waterfront had been purchased 6 years ago by Garrett Thomas Caldwell, sole owner, no co-borrowers, no liens. Vivian Caldwell's name was nowhere on the document. What I also found, digging through public records with Patrice's guidance, was that Garrett's company had a standard rental contract template, and that the villa was listed on 2 short-term rental platforms under a management account that Garrett controlled. Vivian didn't manage it. She lived in it, rent-free, at her son's discretion. She was a guest in her own performance. I called Garrett on the 3rd day. I kept my voice even. I told him I needed us all to meet, me, him, his mother, and my parents. I told him I thought it would be good to clear the air before we moved forward with any wedding planning. He hesitated, and I could hear him calculating. And then he said yes, because saying no would have required him to explain why, and he wasn't ready to have that conversation. The meeting was set for a Saturday, 2 weeks after Patrice had pulled those records. My dad drove. My mother sat in the front seat with a thermos of coffee and a composure I recognized as the kind you build slowly, over years, by surviving things quietly. I sat in the back and looked out the window at the flat gray of I-75 and thought about what my father had said in the parking lot outside that gas station. She was testing you. She wanted to see what you'd do when she pushed, and you stayed in the room. I wasn't going to stay in the room this time. Vivian met us at the door the same way she had before, immaculate, controlled, the silk with fishing line smile already in place. Serena was not there this time. I noticed that immediately. Vivian had decided this was a performance for a smaller audience, which told me she understood, on some level, that the ground had shifted. Garrett was in the sitting room when we came in. He stood when we entered, and he looked at me with an expression I'd been trying to decode for weeks, something caught between love and guilt, and a kind of helpless apology that kept offering itself up without ever actually changing anything. We sat. Vivian poured nothing this time, no champagne, no performance of hospitality. She sat across from us with her ankles crossed and her hands folded in her lap and waited. I wanted to come back, I said, because I think there are some things that need to be said clearly. Cassie, Garrett started, let me finish. I looked at him and something in my voice made him close his mouth. I turned to Vivienne. You said something when we were here last time. You called my parents broke nobodies trying to crawl into high society. You said it sideways, like a comment, like you were talking about the weather. And I stayed in the room. I didn't walk out with them, and I should have, and I want to say in front of everyone here that I'm sorry for that. I paused. Mom, Dad, I'm sorry. My mother's jaw tightened, but her eyes were steady. My dad gave me one small nod. I looked back at Vivienne. But I'm also here because I found something out that I think changes the nature of this conversation pretty significantly. Vivienne's expression didn't change. She was good. She had been doing this for a long time. This house, I said, this $6 million villa that you've been presiding over like it makes you the authority on who is and isn't good enough, it's not yours. The room went very still. I beg your pardon, Vivian said. Pinellas County property records. Garrett Thomas Caldwell, sole owner, purchased 6 years ago. I pulled the printout from my bag. Patrice had printed it in clean, readable format and set it on the coffee table between us. You don't own this property, Vivienne. Your son does. You live here at his discretion. You've been standing in his house calling my parents nobodies. Garrett had gone very pale. Vivian looked at the paper on the table. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to. She knew what it said. "That is a private family arrangement," she said, and her voice had dropped to something quieter, something that had lost the performance. "It is," I agreed, "and it's also the reason I'm not particularly impressed by the way you chose to welcome my family into it." I looked at her steadily. "You don't have $6 million, Vivienne. You have a son who let you live in his house. Those are very different things. And my father, who built his own business with his own hands and owns his own home free and clear and never once asked anyone to subsidize his dignity, he's not a nobody. He's just not performing for you." My dad made a small sound then. Not a laugh this time, something quieter, just a breath, the sound of a man hearing something land correctly. Vivian's composure cracked. Not all at once. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scene. It was more like watching plaster give, a small, fine fracture that spread slowly across the surface of everything she'd constructed. Her chin came up, her eyes went flat, and underneath the flatness was something I hadn't expected to see there, something that looked, if I was reading it right, like recognition. "You think you're clever," she said. "I think I'm honest," I said, "which is more than I can say for how you've been operating." "Garrett," she turned to her son, "are you going to allow this?" Garrett sat forward and put his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands for a long moment. And when he looked up, he looked at his mother, not at me. "Sam," he said, "I need you to apologize to Cassie's parents." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in a quiet room. "Excuse me?" Vivian said. "A real apology, not a clarification, not a misunderstanding, an apology for what you said." He looked tired, genuinely, bone-deep tired, like a man who had been managing a situation for years and had finally admitted to himself that management wasn't working. "I should have said this the first time. I should have said it before we drove home. I didn't, and that was wrong, and I'm sorry for that too, Cassie." He looked at me. "I really am." I believed him. That was the complicated thing. I believed him, and it didn't fix everything, but it mattered. Vivian sat with that for a long, long moment. The fire wasn't going this time. The room was cooler, the flowers fewer, the performance thinner. She looked at my parents, and I watched her work through whatever calculation was happening behind her eyes. And then she said, in a voice stripped almost entirely of its usual architecture, "I owe you an apology. What I said was unkind, and it was wrong." It wasn't effusive, it wasn't warm, but it was real, more real than anything she'd said to us in that room before, and my mother received it with the same quiet, clear-eyed steadiness she'd brought into the house. "Thank you," my mother said simply. Then my dad looked at Garrett. "Son," he said, in the tone he reserved for conversations that mattered, "I want you to think carefully about one thing." Garrett met his eyes. "A man who lets his mother treat the woman he loves like that and stays quiet isn't protecting anybody. He's just avoiding the harder thing." My dad leaned forward slightly. "The harder thing is worth doing, every time." Garrett didn't look away. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I know." What happened after that unfolded slowly, the way real changes do, not in a single dramatic moment, but across weeks and months, in small decisions that added up to something new. Garrett had a direct, honest conversation with his mother that I wasn't present for. He told me about it afterward, and I believed the version he gave me, because it matched what I saw in Vivian's behavior going forward. She didn't become warm. She didn't become my champion. But she became, gradually and unmistakably, a woman who understood that the rules had changed and that she was no longer the one writing them. She stopped texting me her little observations. She stopped the comments about the diner. When she called, she asked about my life with the careful courtesy of someone who had been reminded that courtesy is not optional. Garrett and I had the long conversations we probably should have had a year earlier, about his habit of managing his mother instead of confronting her, about my habit of staying in rooms I should have walked out of, about what we actually needed from each other if this was going to work. Some of those conversations were hard. A few of them were very hard. But we had them, and we didn't look away from what they turned up. I called Patrice the morning after the meeting at the villa, and she listened to the whole thing, and then she said, "Good. Now go home and feed those cats." Which was exactly the right thing to say. Ruthie was 11 by then, slower than she used to be. Her suspicious expressions softened around the edges by age. Smoke had developed a preference for sleeping directly on my face, which was inconvenient and also, honestly, a comfort. They were still my constants. Some things hold. Garrett and I got married the following June, in a small ceremony in Harwick with about 40 people, my parents, a handful of friends, his dad flying in from Florida, and Vivian sitting in the front row in a pale blue dress, composed and correct, and not saying anything that wasn't said to someone's face. It wasn't the family dynamic I'd imagined when I first said yes on that January night on Clover Street, but it was real. It was honest. It was built on ground we'd actually cleared. My dad walked me down the aisle. Halfway down, he leaned over and said quietly, "You walked out of the room this time." "I did," I said. "Good girl," he said, and he meant it the way he always meant things, without performance, without drama, just cleanly and completely and true. I think about that November a lot, the cold drive, the iron gate, the marble foyer, the champagne nobody asked for. The way Vivian Caldwell stood in a house she didn't own and tried to make my parents feel like they had no right to be there. The way my father laughed, not to wound her, not to win, but because he was 63 years old and he had earned the right to find certain things genuinely funny. She thought she was showing us what power looked like, but my dad already knew what power looked like. He'd been watching it his whole life, from the inside of other people's walls, pulling wire in the dark, building things that lasted. He knew the difference between the performance of it and the real thing. The real thing doesn't need marble floors. It doesn't need a $6 million address or a French manicure or a carefully aimed comment about nobodies. The real thing is a man who can sit down at a stranger's kitchen table and make them feel like they matter.